Well, thank you very much. I think it's particularly fitting, and it was part of the reason I was pleased to start the day this way today. Because in some ways, I'm about to embark on a day, this 4th of July, that though it's not going to include going down and having hot dogs and hamburgers and barbecues and the other things that these days we identify with the 4th. It is going to be a day that was the kind of day the founders had in mind when they first designated this holiday. And it's interesting that we don't often reflect on the fact that we call this Independence Day, right? And we live now with the notion that somehow what happens on this day is we commemorate the fact of the independence of those 13 colonies that had been subject to Great Britain and then severed their tie with Great Britain and became separate and independent states, right? That's what we're celebrating today. Well, actually, it's not. It's not at all what we're celebrating today. If we were celebrating that, the severance of ties with Great Britain, that actually took place on July the 2nd. The resolution that produced that severance was passed by the Congress, adopted by the Congress, introduced by Richard Henry Lee and adopted by the Congress. A resolution that basically said all ties with Great Britain ought to be and are severed. And these are now free and independent states. That happened on July 2nd. And yet we don't gather on July 2nd. Why not? Because we're not commemorating that act. On July 4th, the same Congress adopted the document that is associated with independence in our history, the Declaration of Independence. The act had already taken place. What we celebrate on July 4th are the words with which that act was communicated to the public and to history, and the ideas that those words conveyed. And by designating the 4th instead of the 2nd, the founders were actually, I think, intentionally providing for a consideration of the document every single year. They intended for us not to celebrate the act and the fact and the this and the that only. No, they wanted us to look carefully every year at the document that they had adopted, never forgetting the ideas and, most importantly, the underlying premises and logic of that document. Because once we did, we would cease to be capable of sustaining our liberty. Well, I've got an ominous thought for you. How many times now, on the 4th of July, is the day celebrated by a careful examination of that document? How many speeches focus upon that document? Properly understood, it's what the person who occupies the office of president ought to do every July 4th. They ought to make sure that they are the focus of a gathering in which the ideas of the Declaration are articulated in the context of our life today, so that our people refocus on the truths that make us free. But that doesn't happen. Instead, what is happening, I'm sad to say, are all kinds of things that suggest that just as the founders feared, once we forgot the document, we would lose the liberty. And we move down an ever more ominous road in which the conclusive loss of that liberty lies just around the corner, and then it will be done. And I think that part of the reason for that is also part of the reason why it's appropriate for me to start my day in a place of worship. Because the one aspect of the Declaration that I think is most disturbing to the people who now wish us to turn our back on the traditions that make us free is that the Declaration grounds the whole idea of representative government and constitutional government, government of, by, and for the people through mechanisms that ultimately correspond to the responsible choices and elections of the people, grounds the whole thing on a simple premise that human beings have, as a result of God's decision, certain rights that must be respected if government is to be lawful and legitimate. And of course, that invocation of the Creator God, was this an accident? Was this just something, I mean, some of these people would like us to believe, well, that's just the way they thought in those days, and so forth. No, I'm sorry. The reason it's not an accident is because even if you want to turn your back on the invocation of the Creator God and His authority, on the direct references to His providence and His rulership of the universe that are there in the Declaration of Independence, whereby the founders justified what was, after all, a grievous action. Living as we do in the context of the great and powerful, for the moment still, nation that sprang from their beginning. We can forget that when they made that decision, what are we talking about, this continental? It was the Second Continental Congress. Who were these people? Well, they were actually a relatively small, because their sentiments were still not a conclusive majority of the people of their time by any means. And they had come together in a very confused context in American life, in which you still had people who were steadfast in their desire to remain part of the British Empire and retain their loyalty to the King of England. And you had others who were, as people are even these days, totally indifferent. They just wanted to be left alone and didn't understand why anybody was making a fuss over all of these things. And then you had folks who believed in liberty and rights and all of these things, but they didn't want war. They had to be achieved by anything, so long as it didn't lead to a test of arms and a conflict that could lead to the loss of life and property. And they were steadfast against it. And then you had the folks who gathered there in Philadelphia and who were willing to formulate and put their names upon a document that, by declaring independence, plunged the nation inevitably into that armed conflict. And the people who were willing not only to profess the rights and love the liberty, but to take the step that would require that they defend it with their lives and their fortunes and their sacred honor, they were few. And their future was by no means secure. Indeed, they lived constantly in the fear that at some point, after that declaration passed, they were going to be apprehended. And they wouldn't have ended up in the statuary halls and revered by the people. They would ended up on the gallows. And they would have been entrusted in their remains to forgotten and dishonored graves. And every step they took for the next several years, they lived in the shadow of that fate, which is reserved not for the great statesmen who found countries based on successful revolutions, but to the defeated and condemned rebels who suffered the just punishment for their treason. That was what they were doing. That took guts. And we don't want to stop and pause. Where did they get the courage to do that? It couldn't have come, by the way, from the sources that a lot of our politicians these days like to pretend must be our motive, which is to have a nicer house and a more secure job and more wealth and so forth and so on. Wouldn't have made any sense, would it? Because indeed many of them, you can count the people who signed the Declaration, and many of them lost children, lost their own lives, lost their property, saw their houses burned, and ended up as a result of it all as penniless paupers whose only treasure was the honor of their compatriots. They did not all suffer this fate, but they were all willing to do so. So their motive couldn't have been that they were going to see some material gain. See? And even though now, people who like to lie, I think, about the nature of that revolution, they want to, well, the grievance was material, it was all about taxes. Even today, the Tea Parties are premising it on taxes and so forth.